This is KPPQ LP Ventura, 104.1 FM, and we're in the Women's Room, where we appreciate and support each other. I'm your host, Kathleen Good. My guest today is Marsha De La O, poet and friend of In the Women's Room. Marsha has written 3 books of poetry, Black Hope, Antidote for Night, and Every Ravening Thing. She has published poems in many national journals, including The New Yorker, as well as editing a poetry journal, Spillway, with her husband, Phil Taggert. Marsha, we're so happy to have you here again today.
Thank you. I'm very glad to be here.
I asked Marsha here today to tell us the story of the first poet. Do you know who it is? Marsha wrote a poem in honor of this mystery person for her latest collection, Every Ravening Thing. But first, Marsha, let's talk a little bit about the overriding theme of your most recent book. And what is that?
I would say the overriding theme is trauma.
And do you mean trauma in general, or do you have a specific type of trauma in mind?
I had in mind trauma caused by violence, and there are a range of different characters affected by violence, including men, in the book.
Is your book a collection of feminist poems?
I would say yes. Yes, they are feminist poems. They don't all deal with women, but they are feminist poems in the sense that they look at the patriarchy and violence as a part of the patriarchy.
And for today, you've chosen the poem Enheduanna, for the poet Enheduanna of Uruk, 2350 BC. And I hope I pronounced her very difficult name correctly. Marsha will pronounce it better. So, Marsha, tell us about this poet.
The poet Enheduanna of Uruk was probably the chief priest, because they did not have gendered term priest-priestess, in the city of Uruk about 5,000 years ago. And her goddess was Inanna, who was the most important goddess in the pantheon of deities. And about 5,000 years ago, the city of Uruk was overrun by a conquering army, and this woman, this priest, Enheduanna, was raped and exiled.
Okay. Well, maybe now would be a good time to read the poem for your listener, and then we can talk about her fascinating story.
Okay. For the poet Enheduanna of Uruk, 2350 BC. She considers the shape of an idea that lightning resembles a feather. The poet presses her wedge-shaped reed into soft red clay. A shaft and slender barbs, this reed, plucked from the banks of the Tigris and cut into a stylus. Tigris Sunrise is one of her names. Her name is color and motion, her liquid name. Cloudscapes release their charge with a strike. A shaft and feathering, lightning and feather. Same symbol for both, line and cross-hatching, small flag in strong wind. Her name is light. A corona forms around the central shaft. A tree reaches upward to call lightning down, a night enfeathered with storm, darkness split with branching light. When Uruk fell, her temple destroyed, Lugalan the conqueror defiled her. Always she remembers the little pouch his fish lips made as they parted and came together before he smiled. She considers the words weight, a narrow gorge, a ruined heart. Lightning is not ethereal. Even a feathery corona smashes against a roof like a load of sun-baked clay. He keeps her alive. But why? That people might witness her debasement, his trophy. He keeps her alive. She considers lightning and feathers. The charge enters at the nape of her neck and flows downward like water. Her limbs start up in a concord of fire and water, and her hand picks up the stylus, this chance to sing back the world. This is how an exile returns to the city. The poet presses her wedge-shaped reed into soft red clay. She inscribes her name, Ninme Sarah.
Wow. Well, I hope our Women's Room listeners will be as fascinated as I was to learn that the poem is dedicated to and is about the first known poet of the ancient world, and she was a woman. So, Marsha, she actually, as it says in the last words, she actually signed her clay tablet poem in 2350 BC. What is the significance of this act?
Well, it's hugely significant in that there were many clay tablets that contained various myth stories and verses on them in ancient Sumer, but none of them had a name.
Wow.
So when she decided to put her name on her poems, which were all hymns to Inanna, praising her and asking for her help, she was doing something completely radical.
Wow, sort of like the wheel being invented.
Yes,
Yeah.
and she becomes thus the ancestor of all other poets who signed their name.
Wow. So how did you come across her poetry? And also what is the backstory to this timely poem that's so relevant in our days of #MeToo?
Well, I came across some of the myths of Inanna through Diane Wolkstein's book and storytelling, feminist storytelling in the 90s. And it took some time more than that for me to realize that there was this separate set of poems in praise of Inanna that was written by Enheduanna.
So when you heard Enheduanna's story, what did it spark in you as you heard her pain down the centuries? I mean, this is like 5,000 years ago she wrote this.
Well, I was so struck by the fact that this is exactly what women are still dealing with. And in 2017, when the #MeToo movement started, the decision really was made to bring your story forth with your name attached. And
Wow.
that made all the difference, that the names allowed more names to come forth so that the structural problem of violence against women could be examined. And that's what she did 5,000 years ago.
And we're still doing it.
Exactly.
So do you think writing this poem for her became in part her healing from that violation of being overthrown from her position, raped, and then exiled to the hills?
Absolutely. I try to, in the poem, make the lightning strike become a form of power for her, that she's channeling the fire that it took to write what she was going to write. And then the act of signing her name was the act of reclaiming herself.
Wow. Now, you talked about how the poem deals with the consequences of patriarchy in terms of imagining God as a male and how that figures into the treatment of women. What if people imagine God as a woman?
I think if it were possible to imagine God as female, that it would definitely change the status of women. Major world religions see and image the highest sacred authority as masculine. And oftentimes the restrictions around who can access that God via the priesthood are relegated to the male, and thus women are seen as outside the sacred, and from there it's a short hop to polluted and unclean.
So, I heard her, as you did, her pain down the centuries. And when we talked about this poem, and just prior to reading your article, the article about you in the BC Reporter, I was in London. And I saw a wonderful feminist play called Emilia. And it was about a woman named Emilia Lanier, a woman poet who was a contemporary and friend of Shakespeare, and a published poet, unheard of in 1610, when women were not much more than domestic animals, useful mainly for giving birth. She was a woman who spoke out about the abuse and tears of women. So Enheduanna, sounds very like her in this, all the way down, all those centuries. Occasionally women stand up and speak out. And this is what she did. What is the universal lament of those few women who cried out?
I want to talk about those few women, that idea that there were only a few. I think that we have to look at how we know this. And in Shakespeare's time, it was unusual for women to be educated. They were not necessarily literate. I'm not sure about ancient Sumer, but it is a key. Education is a key thing when it comes to writing.
Well, yeah.
And Enheduanna signed her name because she knew the language. She knew the language.
Wow.
So access to education is key. But as to regards to your second question, what is the universal lament of those few women who cried out? I think it is selfhood. It has to do with selfhood. Their voices are not taken from them if they can articulate it in a way that stays.
And the poetry is one way that it stays.
Evidently so.
And here we are 5,000 years later, and you are a woman who is still speaking out about abuse and trauma. Do you feel connected to Enheduanna?
Yes, I absolutely do feel connected to Enheduanna, and I know some other women do as well, partly because we both write. She was a poet, and I'm a poet, and I feel also that she was reaching for spiritual balance in the world, and I think women are also reaching for that balance today.
And what do you mean by spiritual balance? Do you mean the masculine and feminine attributes?
Absolutely, yes. That she was reaching within her society for equivalency with men.
Wow. So talk a little bit about a woman priest and the power she would have had before she was crushed in ancient Sumer.
Okay, so in Sumer, there was a polytheistic pantheon, meaning that they had gods and goddesses. And that's the usual thing, that there would be gods and goddesses.
Go ahead.
Yeah, throughout the Middle East.
And in the ancient world.
And in the ancient world, yes. So that idea that there was a female image of the sacred did allow for women to relate to the sacred. There were women gods. There was no gendering at all of the idea of priest, priestess. There was no need for the word priestess, because whoever it was that stood in that relationship to God or goddess was a priest. It wasn't necessarily a matriarch, but Inanna herself seems to have been the most powerful of all the gods, as far as they can tell by images and stories about her from ancient Sumer.
Yeah, and it's easy to confuse the two names, Enheduanna and Inanna.
Yes.
So just to remind our listener that Enheduanna is the author of the poem that Marsha De La O wrote a poem about. Inanna is the goddess that Enheduanna worshipped.
Yes.
Okay. So monotheistic belief system, much like our own, which has only one God, a male god, presumably like the patriarchal one that the conqueror Lugalan in the poem, would not have been able to accept a woman as a high priest or in a woman in any position of power. So he had to do away with her. Is that, did I read that correctly?
I'm not exactly sure how much is known about the exact history of why he had to do away with her. But going back to the idea of not being able to accept a woman as a high priest or in any position of power, I think we see that today in terms of many of the churches that come from the desert God, the monotheistic God.
The one God.
The one God that came out of the desert and that is the basis for Judaism, Islam, and Christianity, ultimately Christianity. And that is a God without a consort. A God without a female side to him. And women, as a consequence of that, are outside the sacred. So you see it today where the Southern Baptists take a position. Men preach to women, but it is always inappropriate for women to preach to men.
Okay, and we're going to have to leave it there, and we're going to come back with some more questions about a polytheistic collection of gods. This is KPPQ LP Ventura, 104.1 FM, and we're in the Women's Room, where we appreciate and support each other. I'm your host, Kathleen Good. My guest today is Marsha De La O, poet and friend of In the Women's Room. Marsha is reading and discussing her poem for Enheduanna of Uruk, 2350 BC, which is an homage to the first poet, who happens to have been a woman. Okay, and we're back. And we've been talking about the patriarchy and polytheistic a society where they believe in many gods. So thought-provoking. So the polytheistic pantheon of gods, in it, would it be correct to assume there most likely were gods with feminine attributes as well as gods with male attributes? And if gods and goddesses were both worshipped, so naturally women had a more elevated status. Could you comment on that?
I think it's possible that is true. I think it's true, for instance, that polytheistic societies tend to be more tolerant than monotheistic societies, because monotheistic societies believe that there's one God, they know who or what he is, and all the others are wrong, whereas polytheistic societies make the assumption that there are many gods, they take many forms, including more feminine, and therefore there is not as much need to battle over who is right and who is wrong. And certainly we do know that polytheistic societies have more place for women as sacred beings and as priests and channels of the sacred.
Right. So it would be just more natural to believe that women could be part of the sacred because they actually honored women gods or worshiped them or prayed to them, probably had little statuettes of them.
Oh, yes.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Okay. So would you think a society with a polytheistic many-pan would be more conducive to a belief in a total equality of the sexes?
I would think so. I do believe that every major religion today is based in a patriarchal attitude. But I would like to hold out for that idea of total equality for the sexes.
Right. We got to give. Right here would be a good place to recount the story of the Inanna myth, the goddess whom Enheduanna invokes and appeals to in her poem.
Well, the thing about Inanna is not only that she was the most popular deity in ancient Sumer, but that she was so changeable, that there was so much growth and differentiation that took place during her mythic story. She's not a fixed personality. So at one point in the myth of Inanna, She was the goddess of heaven and earth, so she's a fertility goddess. She's not so much a mother goddess, and she's not specifically a sex goddess. She more imbues the entire growing world. And at one point in her story, she sets her ear to the underworld and decides to descend. So that part of her story is known as the Descent of Inanna. And what's so interesting about that is almost nowhere else in all the various hero stories do we ever have a female figure pass into the underworld.
Oh.
And Inanna does, and does manage to return through an amazing story. So we have, Orpheus and Aeneas and Virgil, etc., 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 Jesus, all of them going down to the underworld, and Inanna. So Inanna fits the attributes of the questing hero in a way that we haven't heard in our stories in our society.
And we keep saying we need more women heroes. We need more profiles of women who are in positions of power. Yeah, and we need not to make fun of them.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah, which is a thing that's been done in the last few years more than ever. Well, maybe not more than ever, but it certainly is happening.
But more publicly than more publicly than ever from the office, from an elevated office by a powerful country with ostensible beliefs in the equality of men and women.
Right. So Enheduanna lived in a culture, and she invoked this goddess whom she worshipped, Inanna. What does her invocation tell us about the culture that she lived in?
It tells us that there was a place for female power.
And this is a story we do not have, a myth we do not have in our own culture.
And was just came into knowledge, into our knowledge in the late 80s about something that happened 5,000 years ago.
Yeah. What sort of power would Enheduanna have had as a high priest?
So she was a high priest, and I want to acknowledge that she was also, they believe, perhaps the daughter of Sargon, who was the king of Uruk. So she had great power, and with power comes privilege, and that may explain her access to learning. But certainly in the cultural life, in the ceremonial life of the city, she had great power, and as such, as a symbol of that would have been one reason why the conqueror would have wanted to humiliate her. To destroy the god she served as well.
Oh, wow, yes. So, a really good takeaway from your poem and your talk is how important education is for women in order to have voices. That even the educated woman must be silenced, sent away, or or put down. It seems like. Your husband said something. Her husband is Phil Taggert, poet laureate of Ventura County, and he told me that women changed everything in poetry, that by writing about emotions, they open poetry up. Is this true? It seems like women not only changed poetry from a male-dominated art form in contemporary times, but a woman also seems to have invented poetry in the first place.
Great statement. I think women poets are everywhere in contemporary times, as well as poets who come from diverse backgrounds, poets who have been refugees, and poets who are people of color or are differently abled now are speaking up, and I think that's wonderful.
So, do you think that men are copying women by putting more emotion in their poetry? Much as Shakespeare, who was purported to have lifted ideas from Amelia Lanier's work back in that Elizabethan age. I spoke of her earlier as a play that I saw in London. So you think this is true? Men are now copying women.
Well, just to address the issue of Shakespeare, I think he was so curious and such a dabbler in so many different journals and forms of knowledge, all of which he copied. So he had an amazing synthetic mind,
Right?
And which is great, because I think about men copying women and women copying men. I think poetry throughout the ages, you read a poem and in some ways you're writing to another poet.
Right.
And you could even look at what Enheduanna did as writing to Inanna, whose verses came down to her from an earlier time unsigned. And she just brought the individuality of the woman into the picture.
Right. Wow. Well, and that's not just, that's a big thing. So where does this leave women when their ideas, their knowledge, their expression is taken from them, when they no longer have their voice or it's silenced?
I think it leaves them without their selfhood.
Ah.
I think to have your selfhood, you must reclaim your voice.
Right. And so many women, in even the past couple hundred years, have been writers, but they could not publish, if they did, under their own names. They had to take on a masculine name.
Yes, they had to take on a masculine name because it was felt that not only did men have a monopoly on the sacred, they also had a monopoly on intelligence and on writing.
And education.
Right.
Yeah,
that's why
yeah.
education is so important.
Yes. Your poems address themes that are intense, controversial, and impassioned. Where do you find the courage to speak the truth about the themes of abuse, death, violence, and women's issues? How did you find your voice, Marsha?
You know, I found my voice gradually and over a long period of time. And as I came more fully into selfhood, because selfhood really is a journey that it takes your entire life to fully inhabit, I felt stronger about writing about more controversial themes.
So it took you quite a while to get there.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
So in the last few minutes, is there anything you'd like to say about your love of poetry or about your poems?
I think what I would like to say about poetry is something that I recently ran across in a quote in the interview of one of my teachers, and his name was William Olson, and he was asked, "What's the difference between poetry and prose?" And his answer was, "Poetry is closer to the wound."
Oh, that's compelling.
Yeah, poetry is closer to the wound. It's willing to go there. And I think we have that example from our very first known poet, Enheduanna of Uruk.
Well, we need to stop right there. Okay, well, thank you so much, Marsha, for the gift of reading your original poem and for being a guest on the show as a woman in the arts.
Thank you. I appreciate the opportunity.
We've been talking to Marsha De La O, our very own Ventura poet, who read and discussed one of her timely original poems selected especially for In the Women's Room for the Poet Enheduanna of Uruk, 2350 BC. Her latest book of poetry, Every Ravening Thing, is available at the local library. This is KPPQ LP Ventura, 104.1 FM, and we're in the Women's Room, where we appreciate and support each other. I'm your host, Kathleen Good.